Caroline will be continuing to join us in the next session, which is a discussion panel on a range of different traceability issues. Just to introduce our other panelists, we have Dr. Martin Cole of Wine Australia, Chief Executive Officer. Dr. Martin Cole joined Wine Australia on 15th of November 2021, very recently, having worked as Head of School, Agriculture, Food and Wine at the University of Adelaide. He's internationally regarded for his work as a food scientist with expertise in food safety, food trends and innovation, and the translation of science into community and commercial outcomes. He brings more than 25 years worth of experience in research management across government, academia and industry, including broader agricultural sectors. He's regarded as an influential, inspirational and visionary leader, and has held leadership positions within the CSIRO, overseas and in larger commercial companies. Ian Jones is Head of Research and Development, Quality and Compliance at Treasury Wine Estates. Ian has been in the industry for well over 20 years, having gained extensive practical and technical leadership experience in the wine industry. His early career focusing on winemaking and operational teams to improve quality and operational efficiencies. Over the progression of his career, he's transitioned to senior technical roles, leading a broad portfolio of areas, including laboratories, quality assurance, environmental management, and research and development. In his current role, he leads the direction of Treasury Wine Estates Science and Technology Strategy. He has a Bachelor of Science from the University of Newcastle, majoring in biochemistry and microbiology, and has a Master's Research degree in microbiology and food science from the University of New South Wales. He is also a very active industry member in a range of Australian grape and wine related committees, with the Australian Grape and Wine, with a professional member of the Australian Society of Viticulture and Enology, a professional member of the Australian Institute of Food Sciences and Technology, and has been a committee member of the Wine Industry Suppliers Association. Next, we'll have David Lowe from Lowe's Family Wines. David became head winemaker for Rothbury Estate by 21 years of age, and between vintages in Australia was one of the brat pack of flying winemakers who cheekily taught the French modern winemaking techniques. Moving back to Mudgee to construct his own winery on Tinger, David completed his first vintage at Lowe Wines in 2000. Constantly working with quality in mind, David converted operations at Tinger to certified organic in 2005 and biodynamic in 2011. Known for his icon wine, Zinfandel, David also remains an industry leader in low alcohol and preservative-free wines, such as biological PF Shiraz, as well as his gutsy quartz-loving Shiraz, such as Block 5. Today, alongside his usual winemaking and directing roles, you find David out in the vineyards, working directly with the land as vineyard manager to ensure they're producing the best quality fruit in the most environmentally conscious way possible. We also have joining us Dr. Angus Hewson, writer of Wine Pilot and the Vintage Journal, Wine and Wine Critic. Angus Hewson is a digital wine media specialist, drinks communicator and publisher with a background in wine sales, export, marketing and e-commerce. He's written for a regular wine column in The Australian for 15 years and is the founder of Wine Pilot, the co-publisher of the Vintage Journal, contributing writer to the Gourmet Traveller wine magazine, and other publications, as well as the author of World Wine. Angus has also worked extensively in the digital wine space, including as an e-commerce manager for Aldi Australia and chief marketing officer for Cracker Wines and the Wine Collective. He's a wine judge, holds a diploma in wine and spirits, and started his career in the wine industry as an academic at the University of Sydney, where Angus completed a PhD in the School of Psychology on wine expertise. So we have a very eminent and experienced panel to take us through some questions and some observations on traceability. And I do invite other participants on the call to add your questions into the chat channel, which Ram will be keeping an eye on for questions that we can introduce to our panel as we go. Just to highlight maybe some of the regulatory challenges in the international trade, some of which has been touched on in presentations that we've just had this morning. In terms of this whole discussion is very timely because there is an international set of guidelines under Codex Alimentarius on traceability and food safety, and they haven't actually been looked at for 14 years. And just within the last 6 to 12 months, Codex Alimentarius of which the Australian government is a participant in setting these global standards, has decided to reopen those guidelines on traceability to take into account the major technological advancements that have happened in the last 14 years and how that these could be introduced into sets of global guidelines for adoption in different international jurisdictions. So this conversation's very timely from an international policy point of view. Maybe something worth mentioning as a producer and some of the launch into traceability related requirements in terms of regulatory requirements for export, where there have been on occasions both positive and negative experiences, and two that I'll just mention before passing on to the first of our panelists. The first is that the challenges that were thrown up by both COVID and Brexit presented a very interesting situation for companies who have been actively exporting into both the UK and the European Union. And Wine Australia has very much led the pack in our export industries by being able to provide secure digital VI1 analytical documents for use in export to those countries as part of the entry requirements for our products. And these have been working very well and are an excellent example of traceability and trust between regulators in order to facilitate international trade. And certainly COVID has been a big driver in acceptance of electronic documentation. Unfortunately, as a consequence of Brexit, we started then to encounter some very interesting situations where individual EU member states decided that with the advent of Brexit, and because wine being sent to the UK, bottled there and re-exported into the European mainland, would require a physical wet stamped VI1 document issued by a UK regulator who had until then no experience in providing such documentation. And it just provides an example of a situation where global politics can potentially undo very good work on traceability, trust, and the use of electronic documentation to facilitate trade. The second example, which has been touched on by our previous speakers, and that is the increased requirement by a number of export jurisdictions to have a much more traceability on the sites of production of wine and other food products. And it was highlighted particularly with the US FDA, who use DUNS numbers to track particular sites of manufacture, and how this is going to be important in the new traceability systems using the global location numbers. Using GLN is obviously an existing GS1 standard and very good. And interestingly too, very recently, Russia was making requests upon companies sending product into their market to also make it clear the GLN number associated with the production site for particular products we're exporting into the market. However, there are other markets in the last 12 to 18 months who are starting to introduce a requirement for traceability or clarity on site of manufacture in countries such as China, Korea, and India, all in various states of implementation. One of the problems that we are rapidly seeing with some of these different jurisdictions introducing this requirement is that they are introducing unique requirements for coding and identification of these sites. Sometimes the identification of these sites has to be hard coded onto the physical products themselves. And what this is beginning to develop into is not a traceability system, but a transparency system, which really isn't one that's based on trust, and in some cases has the risk of locking product production into a single site with no ready and flexible way to shift that. And of course, that's not the way modern supply chains work. We can shift sites of production and manufacture in response to capacity, costs, and transport constraint. And so it's just a highlights the need that for traceability systems also need to be responsive to the way in which companies produced products as well, and to have that flexibility to allow sites of manufacture and sourcing of product to be reflected in neutral systems that can be readily updated on a flexible basis. So I'll go to Martin Cole for our first question. Traceability, how does, from a Wine Australia perspective, do you see traceability supporting businesses to deliver a lot of the challenges that you're seeing in Wine Australia, I guess, as both a regulator and promoter of the wine industry? And how do you see these supporting the image of Australian wine for export in the future?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. A pleasure to join this one. So I think we've got just a few minutes, but I mean, you know, I think we're all aware, we're not short of challenges at the moment. We're not short of things to talk about. It's almost, particularly the wine sector, it's almost a perfect storm. You know, we've come off of years of drought and bushfires and things like that, had a almost perfect vintage, and now we've got COVID. We've lost the China market essentially overnight. That's a 30% reduction in export value. We've lost the on-premise business through COVID. Some of that's now obviously returning, which is good. We've got supply chain issues globally, you know, is really impacting shipping of wine. And you've got new demands coming from the consumer in terms of our markets. A lot of new competition in the wine space. So, you know, I mean, it's great. I really enjoyed the case study from Table Grapes. I was involved with some of the early work with Peter with GS1, looking at the whole, you know, standards with the CSIRO mission and stuff like that. So some great progress in terms of the technology. I think you mentioned some areas where we've been able to try and automate some of our regulatory systems. I think the Wallace system seems to have bedded down quite well, and that's looking quite good. I think the key point I wanted to make really was that I think we're only just scratching the surface of what we can do with traceability and data. You know, traditionally we've looked at it I mean, you'll see some good examples from some of the bigger players in terms of fraud, preventing fraud. I've talked a little bit about regulatory modernization. I think we need to be, you know, kind of putting ourselves in the shoes of the users and the customers. So really trying to make those systems very much more easy to use and less administrative burden and stuff like that. But really, I think once you have these systems in place, then you know the next big step change in innovations are going to be through the value chain. And so I think once you've got those systems in place, I think it supports our biosecurity efforts. I think it supports innovation across the supply chain, optimization of the system. And then at the consumer end of things, it really is, you're seeing much more demand from consumers in terms of, kind of credentialing, particularly sustainability credentials, ESG credentials. So the ability to, have those credentials go with a product and to be fully traceable, to be able to tell that unique story of the wines from Australia, I think is a great opportunity, really. So we've got some good case studies. I caught up with the department post the Traceability Summit. We've got it's a bit sobering because some of the discussions we're having, were discussions we've been having for the last 5 years in terms of interoperability and all that sort of stuff. But there's some good progress, some good case studies. I think what we're looking to do here in Wine Australia, we're looking to, do much more co-design and get the customer in the heart of everything we do. And so the whole, digital and data strategy for the wine sector is something that we really want to do a full court press on. As I said, we've got some great examples, but we're only just scratching the surface. So that's something we will be looking to do, is to put, customers along the supply chain together and really look at how we can really bring to bear some of the great opportunities, what might be some demonstrators across different applications there, but really, because I think there's we've got huge issues in the sector in terms of profitability. We've got to get back to some profitability. We've got to get back to value growth, so with new markets and stuff like that, market diversification. And I think really the traceability, the data really is a fantastic underpinner there. We're a little bit behind some other sectors, so I think that's getting our heads together around a strategy for the sector. I think is really very timely indeed. So thanks, Jonathan. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Martin. Ian, Martin mentioned then, I guess, some very key words, and that's sort of credentialing, accreditations, and these are things of, I guess, increasing commercial importance to exporting wine producers, and they present both opportunities and challenges. Can you perhaps just elaborate a little bit on some of your experiences around that space?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I suppose when we look at that space, traceability within companies is quite good. That's a requirement for label integrity purposes for so many things we do within a company. But there's a lot of sharing between companies of movement of parcels of fruit or grapes, grapes or wine. There's a lot of data sharing that goes on with that, a lot of it which is quite manual. And I think when we look in that space, particularly as Martin suggested in comparison to some other industries, data sharing is in its infancy. We've got a lot of way to go to get an understanding of, I suppose, really what controls we need around data sharing, how we can share it with aligned protocols across companies, across the industries, how we govern that, and that there's the security associated with data sharing properties as well. They're all enablers to enable us to progress in this space. We've got quite manual processes across the industry at the moment, particularly as we get down to having an increased requirement for things like product claims, for traceability, for biosecurity, and things that are beyond just the immediate traceability of linked to just the product.
Thank you for that, Ian. Caroline, maybe just to sort of go to you, and I think something that lies at the heart of all of these issues is, obviously, we don't want to go again reinventing the wheel, looking for a new solution when there are some very good solutions that are tried and trusted in other industries that can be readily adopted. When it comes to global data standards, and that's something that's been very clear in your presentation as well. Do you think there's a good understanding of what global data standards actually are?
I think it's a space of learning at the moment, and learning and trialing. So I think these standards are really valuable for a few different reasons. They provide that common language throughout the whole of the supply chain. So it's not just producers who might be putting these into place, but everyone else, such as freight, kind of manufacturing, wholesalers, importers, can all use the same standards. And that can make for a really simple system in some ways, and it can make for kind of frictionless sharing of data as well. So I think that common language actually brings a lot of efficiency to supply chains. It also means that people don't have to work things out from scratch every time. They can just look at what the standard is, and then they can just implement that and know that they're going to align with the rest of their industry and their supply chain, and that those standards will be globally recognized as well. So we used a couple of key standards in our pilot. We used global location number to identify place. We used the GTIN, or the global trade item number, to identify the product. And we talked a little bit about certification today. We didn't use any certification, but there is standards available for certification as well. And then that enables that certification to attach electronically to the product as it kind of splits and aggregates through the supply chain. So I think that's a really important and huge area of potential. And I think there are some really good examples of industries out there who've already put in place kind of a framework for their whole of industry. So the dairy industry's done this using GS1 standards, so that everyone can use that as a kind of cut and paste solution when they come to tackle it for their own business. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for that. David, I think often that there's an assumption when it comes to the wine industry that wine companies all work the same way. And of course, there can be some vast differences in supply chains and complexity between large producers, small and medium-sized family and private producers. And I guess there might be a naive assumption that traceability systems are a very easy thing to, or even a quicker thing to implement for a small to medium company. But is that in fact true? And what sort of, I guess, value adds do you see coming out of traceability systems?
The main issues that we find are when you grow, you make and you sell, and you're a small to medium producer, you generally you control them all yourself with very small resources. And starting from the grower side, we're going to have it's going to be quite difficult for growers to comply and do this, but I think they'll have a great realisation. And in fact, in a funny sort of way, it might be a way to get greater involvement between the grape growing side and the winemaking side, because if you start at the other end, which is the selling side, the market definitely wants to have authenticity. And there's a number of different ways of credibility and authenticity and provenance that have been tried over the years. This might be one of the ways that if we can take the growers along with us, they will realise that they're part of the important food chain all the way along the line. And in the end, they might see that the value they're producing as growers is actually contributing to profitability and income that Martin's so concerned about. And that might allow us then at last to have a conversation about how we can all, growers can be paid more, winemakers can get more authenticity, and the provenance argument is strong with the young people of today. And this is we see it in all these small wineries where people flock to see authenticity, and they see that you grow grapes, they see you make wine, and they see that you sell wine. And now that with a click of a phone, they can go right to the source. And I think, as other speakers have said, we're a bit behind in the wine industry, and I think the growers are where we should be starting. But they're going to be taken kicking and screaming because they've got all sorts of requirements for them. You know, you've got to do this, you've got to have that, another piece of paper, Sustainable Australia, all of these things are difficult for them to comply with. If we can drag them in to see the value at the other end, they might get something more out of it.
No, I think, David, that's a very astute point that I think all too often, maybe sometimes as producers, we impose this upon our growers on high without properly explaining and selling to them the benefits of a particular scheme that we might be seeking their deeper involvement in. So I think that's a very pertinent point. Angus, David used the magic word of authenticity there, and what that means to the consumer, and I guess increasingly what their expectations are, and I guess the way as wine writers, you know, how that authenticity is communicated to consumers as well. And I guess, could you maybe just elaborate a little bit more on what you see coming from consumers, what the expectations are, and does that differ across different wine price points and perceived points of quality?
Thanks, Jonathan. I mean, we know that consumers, they are, as everyone's noted, they're increasingly interested in the source of product, and they're choosing to purchase and consume, based around that. And international organisations doing the same. The Systembolaget in Sweden, which basically buys most of the wine in Sweden, they're bringing in their own sustainability certification in 2022, and you'd assume that only wineries that meet that certification will be listed in Sweden, in the coming years. So it's a big issue at a trade level, but also at a consumer level. I think wine is a beautiful thing, and it's very attractive to consumers because it's clean and green and pure and largely unadulterated. We actually have a fantastic story to tell, and consumers are increasingly going to want us to tell that story, as David knows in the cellar door. And Gen Y and millennials, a lot of ethical consumers there, whom from a wine trade perspective, they want to know the environmental aspects of their wine choices. They want to make sure that the wines they're tasting and drinking and choosing to purchase, are aligned with their philosophy. So I think there's key issues: sustainability of production, long-standing respect for the natural environment, more highly interested consumers. You've got organic and biodynamics as well. And I think traceability actually, if we can do it right, will allow us to tell our story better, because we are a natural product and we can actually tell consumers, from the vineyard. And as David and I know, that's not easy necessarily, but we can tell the story from the vineyard to the winery and even to the shelf. I mean, price points is a real consideration there. Average price in Australia is around the $12 mark. So most consumers, really, wine is just another beverage. It could be Coke. It's not necessarily special. But as you go up the price chain, that obviously that changes, and security changes as well. So I think traceability, we know wine, there's been a lot of, fraud in the wine trade. It's only small volume and total volume of what the wine trade does, but there are a lot of instances of fraud, and, especially in super premium wines. And I think traceability is a way for us to show our authenticity, look after our consumers, give them what they're looking for, but actually also look after brands by making sure when someone picks up a bottle of Penfolds, it is Penfolds. It's not some rice wine that someone's added some red food dye to.
Thank you for that, Angus. And I take particular note of your observation there too, that we're fast moving into an environment where a combination of traceability and certification, unless you have them in place, you're not even going to get in the front door of certain retailers in future. And if they're not in the retailers, they're not in front of the consumers. So it's, I think, a real stark commercial reality, I think, that you've highlighted there as well. I do believe we are very rapidly running out of time. So I just like to thank all of our panel for their observations. I believe that some questions have been coming in online as well, which we won't be able to get to in this session, but we're going to be endeavouring to answer those post this session as well. Ram, I'll happily pass back over to you. Thank you very much to all the panelists this morning.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan, and I really would like to thank you for actually moderating such an engaging conversation. And I would like to thank each and every panelist, the industry leaders in their own right, to be able to share their observations and some of the progress that's been made. Fantastic discussion there. And as always, this is just the beginning of a long conversation. So feel free to stay tuned and please contribute towards the progress of traceability, not just in the Table Grapes and Wine Association related activities, but actually much beyond that. I'd like to, given the shortage of time that we have, so definitely to Jonathan's point, we will definitely make sure the questions are answered offline, and then the responses will be shared back with those that have asked the question. So may I now sort of formally thank the sort of the participants today, the keynote speakers, the panelists, and the industry leaders, and most importantly, all of you who have actually given us the time and the input towards this particular session. I'd like to actually make a special mention of the Agriculture Victoria, the Australian Table Grape Wine Association, Australian Grape and Wine Association, Accolade Wines, Treasury Wines, and a number of key players in this particular space to be able to come together and make this event possible. It's important that we actually define the next steps in order to drive the actions. It's not just the conversation alone. So to this effect, the Secretariat of NGTAG in the next couple of days will send out a short poll survey for you to be able to respond offline. And that would then help us work with relevant industry participants and the entities there to be able to drive those outcomes. So feel free to actually look out for that email, and then please feel free to make some time to answer that short survey. It's going to be very invaluable input from you all. Before I get close, so is always as a continuation. So let's try to stay in touch. You have the QR code that you can see on the screen. If you're not a member of NGTAG yet, feel free to scan that code. And it's a quick one jump to be part of this great conversation, which drives action across a number of different industries here in Australia and also with our global partners. So let's stay in touch, and also most importantly, let's stay safe. And I thank you all for your time again today. With this, I formally announce that the meeting is officially closed. Thank you.